My view of the markets right now, in essence, is that we are really kind of at a crossroads. We're near a Rubicon, and I guess we can start by, since you brought up oil, to me that's really the linchpin of everything that's happening. I ask people often, what makes the dollar the world reserve currency, and very few people know the answer to that question. And prior to, well, right after World War II, we signed an agreement called the Bretton Woods Agreement, where we became the world reserve currency, taking over for the pound sterling. And at the time, the promise was to other governments, hey, we will honor a fixed rate of gold at $35 an ounce. So you take our dollars, and anytime you want to exchange them into gold, it'll be at 35 bucks an ounce, fixed. And it was that way until 1971, when President de Gaulle from France largely realized that we were printing more dollars than we had gold backing it in Fort Knox, the Treasury, and he sent warships over to New York Harbor filled with dollars, saying, give us our dollars, you're creating more money to fund the Vietnam War, we want our gold. And we did. We gave him largely what he wanted, and at that point, Nixon closed the gold window, because within a matter of weeks or less, all of the gold would have been gone. So he went back on our promise. The dollar was backed by nothing at that point. When it was a few years later in 1973 or 1974 rather, that in fact it will be 50 years in a few days, 5 days, I believe it's 50 years, that we signed, 50 years ago, we signed the Petro Agreement, Kissinger did, with the Saudis. And the agreement was, we will protect you, and for that protection, you and OPEC will value oil in dollars globally, and the proceeds or any excess will go into U.S. treasuries, recycle your excess into treasuries. And it's been that way for 50 years. And it has created a synthetic demand for the dollar where every single country in the world has had to stockpile dollars. And I think that trend is nearing an end. And the ramifications of this, I believe, is being vastly underestimated by the public, by the elite, by the economists, by everybody. And a lot of things have happened over the last couple of years that is pushing this trend, accelerating it to the point where I think we are very, very close to ultimately losing the petro status. You could argue we've already lost our hegemony. We have not lost our supremacy, but we have lost our hegemony. And when you realize that the one thing that makes the dollar really is our relationship with Saudi Arabia, probably the dumbest thing that you could do would be to sign an executive order to go green. And that is exactly what Biden did when he came into office. He signed an executive order to go green, but I think it's also relevant to note that the lead economic advisor for the United States government is a bonehead named Jared Bernstein. And a lot of people have seen his interview on Twitter recently, where he was trying to explain how the U.S. sells bonds and uses the proceeds to fund its debt. And he couldn't even get 3 words out of his mouth. That was really embarrassing. But this is a man whose main thesis is to lose the dollar's reserve status, that he's written reports on it called Dethrone King Dollar, picked up in the New York Times. When Trump slapped tariffs on China, he said, great, we'll lose our reserve status now, hopefully. That was picked up in the Washington Post. He's the lead economic advisor to the U.S. government. So if indeed you do want to lose the petro status because it creates distortions and economic imbalances, as he claims, the first thing you would do would be to say to the Saudis, hey guys, thanks for the memories, it's been great. So much so that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia recently came out and said, China was our most important trading partner in 2023 and will be for the next 50 years. Those numbers were chosen, or those words were chosen very specifically. In 5 days, it marks the 50-year anniversary of our petrodollar status. But we're going green, right? Well, to make that worse, let's weaponize the dollar. Let's tell Russia that we don't like what you're doing, and we're the world reserve currency. Now, one would argue, I would, that as the world reserve currency, it is not your prerogative to say who can and can't use it. And the world looks at us these days as being very hypocritical. And it's one thing to sanction and freeze assets. It's a whole nother thing to confiscate those assets. 5 billion of the 280 billion that they want to confiscate, or they have frozen, the Russian assets are in the United States. They want to use those $5 billion in dollars to provide weapons to the Ukraine. The other $280 billion that's being floated around that will take the interest of those frozen treasuries, about $4 or $5 billion a year, and use those to rebuild the Ukraine and provide weapons against the country they are fighting. Now, I see a problem with this. Look, I'm an American patriot. I grew up in this country, and as I mentioned, the least likely character to have ever achieved the success. I thank God every day for this country and the opportunities it gave me. But the leaders of this country are doing some very dumb things, and in particular, signing an executive order to go green, undermining the hegemony of the dollar, weaponizing the dollar. And all of this really came to a head before all of this started, when we left Afghanistan in a way that was very much un-American, leaving 3,000 American people behind enemy lines, and turning our back on the interpreters and the freedom fighters who we gave them a promise, we'll give you visas on the way out, and we didn't. This was not lost on the rest of the world, because 2 days after that happened, Saudi Arabia signed a military protection agreement with Russia. Now, keep in mind, we've been protecting them for 50 years, and that's what's given us the dollar hegemony. They decided to do it with Russia. What else has Saudi Arabia done? Well, they have formally applied to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is the largest regional military and financial organization on the planet. They've formally applied and have been admitted into the BRICS. They've told people in Davos that we're open to taking other currencies for oil. You can see things are breaking away from all of this. And look, if it were just the mismanagement of the dollar globally, I think we'd be okay. Let's bring it home for a minute. And all of this comes into your question, because it's important to look at this from a whole perspective, right? I think the markets are manipulated. There are no free markets. There's just manipulations right now, but this will end badly, and I'll tell you why. So it took 200 years to create our first $1 trillion. We're doing it every 100 days. Every 100 days, we're adding $1 trillion in debt. We have a almost $35 trillion debt, but that doesn't take into account Medicare Part B, $99 trillion underfunded. Medicare Part D, the prescription, $22 trillion. Social Security, $77 trillion. Government and military pensions add up to about $150 or $60 trillion in the hole. And a trillion seconds ago, 31,688 years ago. Game's over. So it's bad enough we've done all of this stuff. We could probably figure out a way to get out of this. But, people look to the United States, and have for a very long time, as a beacon of liberty and justice and freedom, a shining light, if you will, right? Well, let's talk about that for a minute. How about the questions regarding our electoral process? I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. Is it fair? How about the judicial system? I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. Is it fair? Is there a two-tiered standard of justice? Is justice blind? How about the lawlessness in the cities, the open borders where 17 million people have entered this country illegally? If 1% want to fuck with this country, that's 170,000 people. How about 5%? Well, you're getting up real high there. At 5%, you're talking, 800,000 people? That's bigger than any standing military. What happens? Well, it's chaos in a matter of hours. And so I do believe, no matter what the micro perspective is in the markets, that we are at a crossroads. And if this happens, everything resets. Now, but why would they do it, right? Well, 34 trillion plus 155, 160 trillion, we're 200 trillion in the hole. You'll never pay that off, ever. So you reset. And the interesting thing about it is, look at all the unfunded liabilities: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, government, military pensions. Who's that owed to? Us. Who's been selling all the treasuries over the last year and a half? China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Russia. All of the countries around the world are dumping treasuries. Who's been buying the treasuries? That's us again. The hedge funds, the money markets, the mutual funds, everyone leaving the banks, chasing yield, buying treasuries. Roughly only 20-25% of the debt is owed to foreigners. So if you reset the system, as Klaus Schwab said, how do you do it? How do you usher in a CBDC? Well, guess what? The number 2 economic advisor to the government is Lael Brainerd, modern monetary theorist, worked at the Treasury, spent half a year under Powell as vice chair at the Fed. If Biden were to win again, she will be the head of the Federal Reserve. Guaranteed. Modern monetary theorists worked with MIT in development of the new CBDC. Ushered in about 6 months ago, ran point on FedNow, which is Venmo and Zelle on steroids backed by the Fed. It's being piloted right now by a handful of banks. It will get rid of checks and wires instantly. She wants this to happen. She's a modern monetary theorist. But how do you get people to take a CBDC and how do you reset the system without falling on the sword for creating endless amounts of money and brain-dead monetary policy and fiscal irresponsibility? You find a villain. You don't default, you don't inflate, you make them do it to us. You reset the system and all of the debt, 80% of it's owed to us. So you say, listen, Danny, I know you just lost everything, man. Sign on the dotted line and we will make you whole. Take the CBDC and we start over. Now, everything I have said up to this point is fact. Is the actual crossing the line and letting things blow up, incentivizing it? Well, that's supposition. But I will say to you, when you ask me, where are we in the markets? To me, it doesn't matter. I would simply say, if you are not a contrarian, you'll be a victim. If you hold everything in dollars or dollar-based assets, you will go broke.